Now to Scotland. In this week's cover piece, the Spectator's editor Fraser wonders whether Sturgeon really wants to have a second referendum now, despite what she might say publicly. To discuss, I'm joined now by Fraser, as well as our political editor James Forsyth. Fraser, in this week's cover piece, you say that Unionists are actually in a pretty good position. But if we look at that result, the SNP are just one short of a majority. So why is that?
Well, the SNP is very good at telling stories, and the story Nicola Sturgeon has got for the world right now is that Scotland is a kind of country straining at the leash of the Union, all set to have another referendum. And if you hear the language the SNP is using now, that they were complaining that there wasn't a referendum bill in the Queen's speech, for example, that would set the legislation for the next year. But if you actually then rewind and say, on what basis is Nicola Sturgeon making this point? The opinion polls show that independence, while a bit more popular last autumn, has now gone back to the kind of support that we'd seen in 2014 referendum. About 44% of Scots would like to leave the UK. And also, Sturgeon herself, the SNP won fewer seats than it did 10 years ago. So we've seen a kind of decade of stagnation in SNP support. Now, she told us that Brexit would mean that people would be all set to leave the UK. Well, that hasn't happened. The Brexit vote hasn't helped the SNP vote at all. Boris Johnson, supposedly hated in Scotland, doesn't seem to have had much of a negative impact. The Scottish Tories got the same vote share as they did in the last Scottish election. So we've seen the SNP with a lot of things that should move the dial for them simply haven't. So Nicola Sturgeon is engaged in this rather ingenious game of bluff, wanting to tell England and the rest of the world that Scotland is ready to go. In fact, the battle she has got is not with Boris Johnson, it's with the half of Scots who are by no means persuaded that what she says is making much sense.
James, I think if we look at the SNP result, Nicola Sturgeon, as Fraser touched on, been quick to herald it as a big success for them, even a mandate for Indy Ref 2. But is the party suffering from the fact they had such high expectations and made them quite public going into the fact that to fall short of majority does look like a failure?
Yes, I think the view in Westminster and Whitehall is essentially this, which is the situation in Scotland is not great, but it is nowhere near as bad as people feared it could be last autumn. Remember, last autumn, independence was regularly ahead in the polls. Nicola Sturgeon used to tweet out poll results quite regularly. There was a sense that there was a small but definite majority in favour of independence, and the SNP looked almost a lock for a majority at Holyrood, which is a remarkable achievement in a proportionate system. So the fact that the SNP fell just short of an overall majority, and currently more polls show majority support for staying in the Union rather than leaving it, is, I think, creating a certain amount of encouragement. I also think the UK government has positioned itself in a more sensible place. I think if you talk to people who've conducted focus groups in Scotland recently, they say that they think there are two sets of politicians who will get punished by electors right now in the constitutional question. One is the politician who wants to have the referendum almost immediately, and the other is the person who says kind of glibly, well, you can't have it for another 50 years. And I think the danger was at the start of the year is that Downing Street were falling into that trap. Boris Johnson was suggesting that you shouldn't have another referendum for 40 years. I think now the government is saying, look, now is not the time as you recover from a COVID pandemic. Nicola Sturgeon is having to agree with that. And I think that, you are pushing back the date. Now, I think it is certain the government won't grant a Section 30 order. And I think what you will see over the next few months is the SNP trying to kind of whip up a sense of grievance to push the numbers supporting independence up. And I think the crucial thing is that the UK government turns the cheek. Nicola Sturgeon wants lots of arguments about, she wants UK ministers saying, we'll see you in the Supreme Court if you legislate for a referendum. The UK government ministers just need to sidestep those questions.
And Fraser, I wonder, you were talking about the polls and how actually from the unionist point of view things are looking better than they did 6 months ago. Is there an argument that the UK government should just call Nicola Sturgeon's bluff, say, you know what, have your independence referendum, we think we can win it, and that way actually finally perhaps put things to bed?
So this is where I think the Tories, look, and there will be some people who would think, look, let's call her bluff. have that referendum, let's make the case for the union. Let's move the conversation on to questions like what currency would an independent Scotland use? Nicola Sturgeon claims that she'd have a Scottish currency, in which case who would pay people's pensions? What currency would those pensions be paid in? There's so many questions that a referendum campaign would open that I think would really underline the power and the beauty and the point of the union. But then again, you could argue that the UK shouldn't be sucked into this never-ending trap, that they should not be playing the SNP's game by having a referendum whenever the SNP wants one. Personally, I'm more attracted to giving Nicola Sturgeon the referendum if she passes a vote in Parliament asking her for one. But I'm aware that there's quite a lot of unionists who think that would be a disaster and playing straight into her hands.
James, are you one such unionist?
Well, I think what you look at the election results in Scotland, and what you cannot see from them, I don't think, is an overwhelming desire to have a second independence referendum. That was a big part of the SNP platform, and they didn't get over 50% of the vote. If you look at the constituency vote, very marginally more people voted for unionist parties than parties that favour independence. If you look at the list vote, by an even thinner margin, more people voted for pro-independence parties than unionist parties. But given that the most recent referendum the last referendum was in 2014, I really fail to see that there is any kind of supermajority in favour of independence among the electorate that would justify going back on the once in a generation sense that referendum was meant to be for a generation, on the basis that you couldn't ask such a divisive and destabilising question, every other day. So I don't see that these elections actually particularly strengthen the case for independence. They certainly don't suggest that there is, 60% of the Scottish public that is desperate for a referendum.
But James, what I'd like to know is if the SNP were to vote in Parliament for a referendum, what would your position be? Say no or call their bluff?
My personal view is that if the Scottish Parliament were to vote for a referendum now, based on these election results, I don't think that is a sufficient basis for a referendum.
So James, if you're opting for the say no approach in those circumstances, can you talk us through?
Tactically, I wouldn't have the UK government say no. I think it would be much better to have a private citizen challenge the law in the Court of Session. The Court of Session is a fairly conservative with a small c court, and I think it would be likely to strike the law down on the basis that the Constitution is a reserved matter.
And have you got any private citizens in mind particularly?
I don't, but Fraser says in his piece, and this chimes with what I'm hearing as well, is that there is already the kind of funding in place for that private legal challenge. And if by some quirk of constitutional law, they did manage to hold the referendum, I think a referendum held in these circumstances should be simply boycotted by unionists, because the only basis on which you could hold a referendum would be, without the consent of the UK government, would be on the basis that it had no legal effect. And I think unionists should say, look, we're not participating in a referendum that is only taking place because it has no effect.